Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Roel Wyenberg. This time we will continue our reading of Farther Afield by Miss Reed, who has just fallen down the stairs and broken her arm. Amy and I have known each other ever since our college days. She was one of that establishment's brighter stars, excelling in sport as well as work, and would have made a splendid headmistress of some lucky school had she not married within 3 years of leaving college. It was quite apparent that James would succeed in anything he took up. He was a dark-eyed charmer with boundless energy and an effervescent sense of humor. He loved parties and social occasions of all kinds, going to great lengths to arrange outings which would please his friends, and always generous with his time and money. He was, as the saying goes, good with children, and I know it was a blow to both of them that they had no family of their own. Nephews and nieces were frequent visitors to the house, and I think that Amy's spells of supply teaching gave her much-needed contact with children. These spells grew more frequent as James advanced in his career and was more and more away from home. At this time, he was a director of a cosmetics firm, and his work took him abroad several times a year. There were also a great many meetings in the United Kingdom to attend, and Amy was often alone at the lovely house in Bent, the village not far from Caxley and Fairacre, where she lived. I must confess that I had my suspicions about James's fidelity. He was a warm-hearted fellow, as appreciative of a pretty woman as he was of other attractive things in life. His frequent absences from home gave him ample opportunities for dalliance, and although I never doubted his love for Amy, some of his absences seemed unusually protracted to me. Added to that, his homecoming presents to Amy were so magnificent that I personally should have viewed them with some suspicion, even from such a generous man as James. Amy, however, was completely loyal and discreet. Secretly, I had no doubt that she shared my feelings. She was far too astute to be deceived. Nevertheless, nothing had ever been said between us, and our affection increased over the years. Certainly, Amy tends to be bossy and is always attempting to reform me in one way or another, but I am wonderfully resistant to pressure, as Mrs. Pringle knows, and Amy's failure to improve me had not altered the very warm regard which we feel for each other. This immediate response to my cry for help was typical of her, and I tried to tell her so as we turned into the hospital grounds. Still clutching my piece of paper from Dr. Martin, I was ushered into the waiting room of the casualty department with Amy in attendance. There were about 15 of us unfortunates gathered there, some looking, to my inexperienced eye, at the point of death. There were also several children, all of whom appeared to be in excellent spirits. "Sit down, dear," said a nurse briskly, pushing up a wheelchair. It struck me smartly behind the knees, so that any modest refusal was cut short as I sat down abruptly. A lively 6-year-old pranced up to make my acquaintance. "Are you very bad?" "No," I said bravely, "just my arm and leg are hurt." "My sister's bitten her tongue in half," he said, indicating a screen in the middle distance. "She won't let them put the stitches in." I began to hope that the child would be called away. I had quite enough to bear without all this extra harrowing. "Do you know what that's for?" he asked, indicating a small scoop about the size of an ashtray on the arm of my chair. "No," I said faintly. Hadn't this horrible child got a mother somewhere? "It's to be sick in," he told me. "Here," said Amy severely, "you run away and find a book to read. This lady doesn't want to be bothered with you." "I don't want to be bothered with her either," said the horror, moving towards the end of the room, where a battered cardboard box housed a collection of even more battered toys. He selected a fiendish mechanical car which needed to be run over the tiled floor to make it work. The noise was hideous, but infinitely preferable to the child's company. He was still at it when I was summoned to be examined by a doctor young enough to be my son. Used as I am to Dr. Martin's venerable aspect, I had some qualms, but he was quick and competent, and I was dispatched to the X-ray department with yet another piece of paper. Amy waited in the first room and smiled cheerfully at me as I passed to be wheeled down a long corridor. There's nothing, I decided, as we steered an erratic course down the shiny passage, quite so demoralizing as being obliged to sit in a pushchair. By now, the elbow was torturing me, and no matter how carefully the nurse arranged my arm for the camera, I yelped frequently. One of the most painful injuries, she told me, echoing Dr. Martin, and of course it can't be put in plaster. I heard this with mixed feelings. The sling will be a great help, she assured me, seeing my consternation. This one won't, I told her. It's as rough as emery paper. I'll change it, she promised me. This does seem rather antique. Must be war issue. She set me up with one rather less scratchy, and I begged her to accept Dr. Martin's. Dear me, no, she replied, folding it up briskly. Take it home as a spare. After it's been boiled a few times, it will be quite comfortable. We returned in the pushchair to the waiting Amy. The horrible boy had been joined by another, slightly larger, and they were engaged in sticking out their tongues at each other. I'm glad you found a quieter game, Amy said kindly to them. We waited yet again. At last my X-ray photographs were displayed on a screen. A nasty crack along the radius, I was told. Don't move it for 3 weeks and we'll see you then. Don't move it, I thought rebelliously. What a hope. I shuffled crossly toward the door with Amy in attendance. Goodbye, Auntie Hopalong, shouted the rude boy. I think you'd better come straight home with me, said Amy as we left the town behind us. You can't be alone like this. You're practically helpless. And there are some knockout pills which I see Dr. Martin left on the mantelpiece, which you are supposed to take before you go to bed. Lord knows what they'll do. It's terribly good of you, Amy, but I really can't be such a nuisance to you. Besides, there are all sorts of things to see to. Tibby, for instance, and the laundry hasn't been sorted, and the groceries arrive tomorrow, and I have to make some plans with Mrs. Pringle. Then I'll come and stay with you tonight, said Amy firmly. James is away, there's nothing to worry about, and you're certainly not staying alone in the house, so no arguing. I was deeply grateful. If only I could go to sleep, I felt that I would face anything when I woke up. Now all that I craved was oblivion, and no doubt Dr. Martin's pills would help there. The journey seemed endless, but at last the schoolhouse was in sight. I edged my way painfully from the car and was glad to gain the sitting room. Good heavens, I said, catching sight of the clock. It's only 2:30. I feel as if I'd been away for a fortnight. I'm going to heat up some soup, said Amy, then make up a bed for you on the couch here. Mrs. Pringle's left you a note. She handed it to me, then vanished toward the kitchen. It said, Have put all to rights and fed cat. Will come up this evening. Can live in if needed. Amy reappeared in the doorway. I take back all I've ever said about Mrs. Pringle, I told her, giving her the note to read. A handsome offer, agreed Amy. Downright noble, I said warmly. And how long, said Amy, do you think you two could rub along together? Well, I began, and was cut short by Amy's laughter. Chapter 4. Amy Takes Command. Those of us who are lucky enough to live in a village face the fact that our lives are an open book. Those dreadful stories about town dwellers found dead in their beds, having been there for months or even years sometimes, are not likely to be echoed in smaller communities. Here in Fairacre, villagers tardy in bringing in their milk bottles run the risk of well-meaning neighbors popping round to see if they're all right. There are times when this concern for each other seems downright irritating. On the other hand, how comforting it is to know that people care about one's welfare. Mrs. Pringle, of course, had not been able to resist telling several of her friends about the drama in which she had taken part that morning. Thanks to one of Dr. Martin's pills, I knew nothing from 3 o'clock that afternoon until I woke at 10 that night. But Amy evidently had a succession of visitors during that time and was very touched by their sympathy and their practical offers of help. The vicar's wife brought those roses, she told me, waving toward a mixed bouquet which smelt heavenly on the bedside table. And she says you are not to worry about the organ on Sunday, as she is quite able to cope if she transposes everything into the key of C and they cut out the anthem. I clutched my aching head with my sound hand. I'd forgotten all about that. Well, keep on forgetting, Amy advised me. You'll have to get used to the brutal fact that no one is indispensable. I nodded meekly and wished I hadn't. Those pills were dynamite. And Mrs. Willits sent 6 gorgeous eggs and some tomatoes and will do any washing while your arm's useless. That woman's an angel. Luckily, her husband recognizes it. Someone from the farm, I didn't catch the name, Mrs. Roberts. That's it. She'll help in any way you like. Shopping, bringing you a midday meal, anything. People are kind. They most certainly are, agreed Amy, and I'm absolutely flabbergasted at the way they're all rallying round you. I felt slightly nettled. Anyone would think that I am normally such a monster that I do not deserve any consideration. I was deeply grateful for all this concern, but Amy's astonishment was hard to bear. It isn't as though they have children at the school, went on Amy, musing to herself. Even Mrs. Pringle, she continued thoughtfully, called this evening to see how you were. She sighed, then jumped up to straighten the counterpane. Ah, well, people are odd, she said, dismissing the subject. But by this time my irritation was waning, for Dr. Martin's blue pill was wafting me once more into oblivion. The sun was warm upon the bed when I awoke. It shone through the petals of the roses and sent their fragrance through the room. Amy was gazing at me anxiously. Thank God you've woken up. I was beginning to wonder if you'd ever come to. Why, what's the time? 10 o'clock. No, I must have had about 16 hours sleep. How do you feel? Marvelous if I don't move. Can you manage an egg? I sat up cautiously. I could manage an egg and toast and marmalade and butter and lashings of coffee and perhaps an apple. Amy laughed. You're recovered. Do you ever lose your appetite? It improves in a crisis, I assured her. When war broke out, I ate with enormous gusto. The more sensitive types on the staff of that school I was at then couldn't touch a morsel, or so they said, but I had the feeling each meal might be my last, so I made the most of it. Amy laughed and went to the kitchen. I could hear her moving china and saucepans and lay back feeling 1 part guilty and 9 parts relieved. How pleasant it was to be waited on. I tried to remember the last time I had lain in bed while someone else cooked my breakfast, and found it beyond my powers. Tibby came undulating into the room, giving little chirrups of pleasure at having found me at last. He jumped elegantly onto the bed, missing my damaged ankle by a millimeter. I clasped my poor arm in trepidation. Tibby's affectionate attention was a mixed blessing this morning. Before he could do much damage, Amy appeared with the tray. I've cut your toast into fingers, my dear, and I'll spread your marmalade when you want it. I feel about 3 years old, I told her, and backward at that. Eating a boiled egg left-handed is no easy task, and I should certainly have gone without butter and marmalade if Amy had not been there to help me. Suddenly, I realized how horribly helpless I was. It was frightening. Now, about plans, said Amy, putting down the knife. With all these offers of help from kind neighbors, I should be fine, I said. She looked at me quizzically. You haven't tried walking yet, or washing, or doing your hair, or dressing. No, I agreed sadly. And let's face it, you can't possibly negotiate the stairs even with that ankle strapped. I knew this was the plain truth. I've thought it all out. You're coming back to Bent with me. There's plenty of room. I shall be glad of your company, and it will do you good to have a change of scene. So say no more. It's more than generous of you, Amy, but it's no use arguing. I know what you're going to say. Well, Tibby can come too, or Mrs. Pringle has offered to come and feed him, so that's that. We can shut up the house and give Mrs. P the key. Mr. Willett says he'll keep an eye on the garden and mow the grass. But Dr. Martin can be kept informed of your progress by telephone and is welcome to visit you at my house. I looked at Amy with admiration. You've worked it all out to the last detail, I see. I had plenty of time yesterday, and lots of offers from others, don't forget. I nodded in silence. Let's get you along to the bath. Bracing my arm stiffly, for I dreaded the pain when it was moved, I struggled to get my legs to the floor. Once they were there, it was obvious that only the right one could bear any weight. Amy was quite right. I was helpless. She was looking at me with some amusement. Well? You win, you lovely girl. I'll come thankfully, bless you. One arm round her shoulders, I shimmied my way to the bathroom. We were seen off that afternoon by a number of friends and well-wishers. I began to feel rather a fraud. After all, no one could say I was seriously ill. Nevertheless, it was delightful to receive as much sympathy and attention. The vicar and I will see you next week, promised Mrs. Partridge. I've taken the dirty clothes, called Mrs. Willett, and I'll give the place a proper bottoming, cupboards and all, before you're back, said Mrs. Pringle, in a tone which sounded more like a threat than a promise. We moved off, waving like royalty, to the accompaniment of Tibby's yowling from the cat basket I had borrowed from Mr. Roberts. It is only about half an hour's run to Bent, but I was mightily glad to arrive at Amy's house and to be ensconced in the spare room. Some wise person in the past had made sure that the window sills in the bedroom were low enough for the bedridden to admire the view, for which I was truly grateful. Beyond Amy's immaculate garden, bright with lilies and roses, stretched rolling agricultural land. The crops were already ripening, and no doubt the combines would be out in the fields long before my beastly arm was fit to use. In the middle distance, a blue tractor trundled between the hedges on its way to the fields, and near at hand, on Amy's bird table, tits and starlings squabbled over food. There would be plenty to amuse me. How good Amy was! She was making light of taking me on, useless as I was, but I knew how much extra work I should be making, and determined to get downstairs as soon as possible. Tibby, released from the hated basket, was roaming cautiously about the room, sniffing at Amy's rose and cream decor with the greatest suspicion and dislike. He had deigned to drink a little milk, but was clearly going to take some time to settle down. You are an ungrateful cat, I told him. You might well have been left behind with Mrs. Pringle, and she would have bottomed you with the rest of the house. Amy entered with the tea tray. I imagine heavens like this, I said, perfect surroundings and angels wafting in with the tea. But this one's going to watch you spread your own jam this time, she warned me. Later that evening, as the summer dusk fell and the scent of the lime flowers hung heavy in the air, Amy sat by the lamp and switched away at her tapestry. A moth fluttered round the light, tapping a staccato tattoo on the shade, but Amy did not seem aware of it. It was very quiet in the room. It seemed to me that Amy was unusually pensive, and although she had enough to think of, in all conscience with me on her hands, somehow I felt her thoughts were somewhere else. Amy, I began, you know I can't thank you enough for all you're doing, but won't I be even more of a burden when James comes home? It won't be for several days, said Amy, snipping a thread. It may even be longer. There was some possibility of going straight on to Scotland, if he could arrange things with somebody at the office to attend to that end and save him coming back again. There was something in Amy's tone which disquieted me. Despondency, resignation, hopelessness? I had never seen Amy in this mood, and I wondered what was the cause. I don't think I shall need a blue pill tonight, I said, changing the subject. I can hardly keep awake as it is. I'm horribly sleepy too, confessed Amy. She began to roll up her work and glanced at the clock. James usually rings about 8, but something must have stopped him. No doubt there will be a letter in the post in the morning. I shan't wait up any longer. She rose and came close to the bed. Have you got all you need? I've left this little bell to ring if you need me in the night, and I shall prop my door ajar. Tibby's settled in the kitchen, so there's nothing for you to worry about. She bent to give me a rare kiss on the forehead. Sleep well. I'll see you in the morning. After Amy had gone, I turned out the light and slid carefully down the bed. Tired though I was, I could not sleep. It grieved me to see Amy so unhappy. Something more than my problems was eating at her heart. I had not known Amy for over 30 years without being able to measure her moods. That James was at the bottom of it all, I had no doubt. Was the rapscallion more than usually entangled at this time? Was their marriage seriously threatened by the present philanderings? It is at times like this that a spinster counts her blessings. Her troubles are of her own making and can be tackled straightforwardly. She is independent, but both monetarily and in spirit. Her life is wonderfully simple compared with that of her married sister, and she cannot be hurt quite so cruelly as a woman can be by her husband. Conversely, she has no one with whom to share her troubles and doubts. She must bear alone the consequences of all her actions, and coming down to brass tacks, she must be able to support herself financially, physically, and emotionally. I know all this from first-hand experience. I know, too, that there are some people who view my life as narrow and self-centered. Some even find a middle-aged single woman pitiable, if not faintly ridiculous. This, I have always felt, is to rate the value of men too highly, although I recognize that a truly happy marriage is probably the highest state of contentment attainable by either partner. But how often something mars the partnership? Jealousy, indolence, illness, family difficulties, money troubles. So much can go wrong when two lives are joined. Outside in the darkness, a screech owl gave its blood-curdling cry. A shadow crept over the moon and turned my face. Outside in the darkness, a screech owl gave its blood-curdling cry. A shadow crept over the moon, and turning my face into the comfort of the pillow, supplied by James, I decided it was time for sleep. Well, we shall follow Miss Reed into the next day next time.